Internal economy is called to order. First of all, on our agenda, we have the minutes of the previous meeting. Are they approved? Approved. Any business arising from the previous meeting? D'abord, avec l'arrivée de M. Rodriguez,
with the arrival of Mr. Rodriguez, a member of the board has to be designated for the government. Would you have a name to propose? Oh, he's pointing at Mr. Holland. Mr. Holland. Any objections?
Been selected as one of the spokespersons for the Board of Internal Economy, along with Mr. Straw. I'd like to take a few moments to update the board on the members' working group on the LTVP, the Long-Term Vision Plan. You'll recall that at our meeting on February 28th, we discussed the governance of the Center Block Rehabilitation Project and agreed to establish a working group that would report back to the board. And of course, this is a topic that the members of the Procedure and House Affairs Committee have expressed concern about and anxiousness to ensure that members of Parliament are involved in this process. So the working group has now been established and is composed of the following members: the Honourable Judy Sgro, Kelly Block, and Peter Julian. Le groupe servera de tribune pour consulter les députés et guider l'administration.
And they will assist the management on the needs of parliamentarians, bearing in mind, of course, the financial considerations. They will meet next week and report to the board at our next board meeting, or BOI.
Hoping to paint the center block orange.
Well, that'll be interesting. All right. So any other business arising from the previous meeting? No. Let's go on then to number 3, the 2018-19 year-end financial report. Presenting on behalf of the administration, we have Mr. Daniel Paquette avec Madame Hélène Valiquette. Mr. Paquette.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. J'ai le plaisir d'être ici aujourd'hui pour vous présenter le rapport financier de fin d'exercice de...
I'm pleased to be here to provide you with the fiscal report to 2018-19 and the inclusion of the operational budget and the supplementaries for 1920.
Expenditure basis of accounting, which is consistent to the Public Accounts of Canada, which will be published in the fall. It provides the final authorities and expenditures for 18-19, along with comparative information from the previous fiscal year. Le Parlement fournit à la Chambre des autorisations afin qu'elle...
Parliament grants the Chamber sums so that they can fulfill their parliamentary calendar. 2018-19, $506 million represents a reduction of $6.7 million, or 1.4%, compared to the prior budget. The most significant changes are the reduction of $25 million for the pension plan of MPs and $10.6 million for continued investments on our VPRT long-term plan. The debt was 497 in liabilities. This reduction of 6.2%, or $2 million. It corresponds with the planned budgets.
When compared to previous years, salaries and benefits increased by $1.8 million. This is due to one of the adjustments, the one-time adjustments of $25 million made in 17-18, as directed by the actuarial report for the pension plans for the members of Parliament. This reduction was offset by significant investments made in staffing for support of major initiatives such as the food modernization and optimization of services, the House Officer expenditure disclosure, digital strategies to modernize the delivery of parliamentary information, and the long-term vision and plan. Other factors that also contributed to the personnel costs, or to the increase in personnel costs, is the cost of living increase for House administration, along with increasing staffing actions for member staff. De plus, les dépenses liées aux locations et aux licences ont diminué.
Furthermore, we had some reductions in the licensing charges 2017-18, and this renewal has to respect the agreements that are in place. This reduction for repairs maintenance in 2019 compared to the earlier year is linked to measures of resources for security purposes which were undertaken in 2017. 2018-19 figures indicate an increase modest compared to the previous ones, and our totals have risen by $1.8 billion for Parliament and other federal on a cost recovery basis.
Provides comparisons between the two fiscal years about the utilization of our authorities. This does show a slight increase of 0.7% over the previous year. It's important to note that the House of Commons promotes the efficient use of resources and continuously strives to minimize requests for incremental funding whenever possible. For example, the surpluses generated by the delay in the move to the West Block were reallocated to offset costs associated with other initiatives, such as our retroactive payment for economic increase of House administration staff. So as mentioned, our authorities for 18-19 were $506 million, while expenditures amounted to $487. This leaves with a surplus of $19 million. This amount will correspond to the lapse that will be reported in the public accounts this fall. Note that the surplus reflects the fact that the authorities received are intended to support 338 members, and due to the fact that by-elections were held in 5 constituencies during the past year, there were fewer MPs and therefore less support was required, resulting in reduced spending overall. This surplus represents 5.5% of the 2018-19 main estimates voted authorities. The House of Commons typically follows the government's practice of carrying forward any lapsed funds up to a maximum of 5% of our voted main estimates. As such, I'm seeking your approval today to include in our 1920 supplementary estimates a carry forward of $17.4 million, representing that 5% of our last year's voted main estimates. Mr. Speaker, this concludes my presentation, and je suis disponible pour répondre aux questions.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Rodriguez, puis Monsieur Straw.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Paquette. I'm glad to see you here again. Now, the revenues. You give us some numbers. We are giving money or sharing it with other sections or departments? Is that it? What kind of services? Well, we do have a role to play for honor renovations here going on, and this is through Public Works. So we support Public Works, and they reimburse us for those costs. It's a chargeback. Other expenses, technology, for example, TI. We need to establish proper platforms for all our other partners here on the Hill and in the precinct. So this is planned for in the budget. Yes, of course, and we do have agreements and contracts to get cost recovery on those. I'm a new guy here, so are there collective agreements perhaps in play here where this would affect further years? Escalator clauses and such. This would be made public, and if so, when? Well, I think the collective agreement is come to term in 2018-19, so we're currently under negotiation for renewing the contract or the convention collective agreement. This will be part of, once we know where we stand, we'll be making the proper request. And when will that be made public? Once negotiations are successfully closed. And, well, we should know a little bit more at the end of the day today.
Noted, our members usually get excited when they see anything referring to transfer payments. So I thought maybe you could address what that relates to. And then secondly, with the large surplus, obviously during the electoral cycle, there are different costs that are expected to be incurred. I'm just wondering, are there funds in place already for transition that will likely, there are members not running again, whether or not will those of us who are trying to get reelected will be successful or not. There are several that are not running again, including many under the age of 55, who are entitled to severance pay. is that built into this, or is that a separate pool of funds that, will that be referred in a different set of financials?
Okay, all right. To address your first, the transfer costs are the transfers of money for what we pay for various associations that come forward here that the Parliament is a member of to fund the activities of those various associations. So it's very specific to those particular items. Okay. As for what we call the election-related costs or our transition pieces here, the coming year is one where various things, we have activities that reduce because we're in election mode and others increase because of those transfers and onboarding. So we keep track of those very specifically. We don't have a specific funding for that. Looking at how do we offset the surplus that may be created by reduced of some activities by the incremental cost of that. And as I just mentioned, we do have a significant carry forward that's going to be remaining, and making sure that we earmark part of that to cover some of these items, such as the transition support, the onboarding program that we all know are part of that transition for the election.
Thank you.
Julian.
Merci beaucoup. C'était très intéressant, mais là, si
Thank you very much. That's quite interesting. But if there's $7 point some million for next year, you talk about collective agreements, but if I understand correctly, with collective agreements, there's the Protective Services Group. We see them every day, of course. They're very devoted to their job. So there's going to be, from the transfers, the carry forward, will that also serve to perhaps enhance collective agreement with the PPS? Well, the PPS is a unit, an entity, and they have their own source of funds for their expenses and operationals, and these are not reflected since 2015 in our authorities. But this funding comes from where exactly then? The House and the Senate both contribute, I believe, to the pool? No, they have their own budget, PPS, and it's approved by the two speakers. They report to both speakers of both chambers.
The House is part of the estimates.
s'il y avait
So if a situation arose, collective agreement is concluded correctly with the Parliamentary Services unit, could there be a request? Well, it would be up to the management people at the PPS to pay for those agreements. Okay, very good. It's good to know that that option is open. Thank you.
Okay, and I'm go on to the next topic. But thank you very much, merci beaucoup. And as we go on to the next topic, I will ask Madame Bergen to take over to chair the meeting, as I have to leave for the official ceremony to welcome the Vice President of the United States, Mr. Pence. Madame Bergen, please.
Have we adopted the motion?
There'll be some changes around here.
Okay, good. We are going to go on to the next item, which is regulations respecting the non-attendance of members of Parliament by reasons of maternity or care of a newborn or newly adopted child. And we have some presenters here, and I will give the floor to you, Mr. Dufresne.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup, Madame Bergen, membre de la Régie. Alors,
Members of the board, thank you. We're here following a request from the board to talk to you about the content of the potential regulations, which would deal with non-attendance and the rationale for the non-attendance of members due to maternity or care for either newborn or newly adopted child.
a deduction is made to the member's sessional allowance for days of absence in excess of 21 days if the member is absent for no acceptable reason. And the acceptable reasons set out in the Act currently are illness, being on official or public business, or absence due to service in the armed forces. In amendments to the Parliament of Canada Act, a new section 59.1 was added, and it provides the House with the authority to make regulations in order to regulate the non-attendance of members by reasons of maternity or care for a newborn or newly adopted child. And this provision was preceded by studies from the Committee on Procedure and House Affairs, where recommendation was made to consider the family and parental obligations of members so they not be penalized for such reasons. At the same time, questions were raised about the situation of members with respect to ordinary employees. Et donc, nous avons regardé la situation dans les autres assemblées législatives. La situation des députés est différente de celle des employés parce que les députés, même lorsqu'ils sont responsables d'obligations parentales. Oh.
We're not getting translation.
Try again, please. Thank you. So the situation of MPs is quite distinct and different from those of the employees because employees have a public responsibility and they are always responsible, even if they are in non-attendance, if there's a maternity or paternity issue involved. So the issue is to determine whether or not their non-attendance in the House, if for family reasons, should be treated differently, either more liberally or less so, given their public responsibilities.
Most of the assemblies, legislative assemblies, do not penalize financially members who are absent from the sittings for such reasons. And there are varieties of, some will include periods, some will not. Indeed, some assemblies have looked at issues such as proxy voting in some such situations. What we have brought for the board's consideration is a proposal that could consider as valid reasons for the absence from the chamber the period before the due date, given that the Act talks about maternity for pregnant member. And so that could be a period of 4 weeks, could be a different period. In terms of care for a newborn child or care for a newly adopted child, consideration could be given to a period of 12 months or another period. In any case, these would be decisions for the House to make, and options for this board could be to refer the matter to Procedure and House Affairs Committee, or to have agreement that a member would put forward a motion proposing the regulations. And so with that, I would open it to questions.
All right. Mr. Strahl?
Thank you, Mr. Dufresne, for those comments. I think that we certainly are supportive of making the procedure, the regulations, such that pregnant or newly new parents are now. Just to be clear, we're talking about mothers here, primary women. In this case, we're not talking about parental leave. This is more a maternity situation, as I understand it. So I just want some clarification on that, or because obviously, those of us that we're. Could you maybe just address that right off the hop? Are we talking about if one of our members, if a father wants to take some time for paternity leave, is this also apply, or is this just for mothers?
Mr. Shaw, the first part, if we are talking about the 4 weeks before the due date, that would be only for the mother. The 12-month after the birth or after the date of adoption could also be for any parent. Okay.
Now, and I guess you've done some analysis here with the employment insurance maternity and parental benefits, there's a maximum number of weeks for which an individual is covered. Does this proposal that we're looking at 13 months, I guess, with what you've put on the table, I don't believe, unless there's a medical component to someone's maternity leave, that they would get the same number of weeks. Did you do that analysis? Can you speak to that?
So they would not in terms of employment, in terms of insurance. We in the supplementary report that was made in the Procedure in House Affairs was mentioned of 55% of income protection for such employees. There are some other employees with different regimes where it's a higher percentage.
I'm less concerned about the way. Obviously, in this case, we're talking about retaining 100% of pay and benefits, which again is perhaps different than our constituents would receive in most jobs. But I'd like to know the number of weeks for which this is for one of our constituents who works at a restaurant and pays into EI and goes on maternity and parental. I believe the maximum is 50 weeks with a 2-week. So I just want to. I'm not even saying. I just want that knowledge for us. What additional number of weeks are we proposing here than someone would get if they were just if EI was their only support available to them?
So I'll take that question. Thank you. In terms of a comparator with EI, currently what's available to them through EI would be up to 12 months at 55% or up to 18 months at 33%. And I think one of the nuances that we want to make here is that we're not, in the cases of EI, those employees are actually leaving the workforce. They're not employed during that period. They have no functions, whereas here we're simply talking about reasons that would be reasonable for non-attendance in the sitting. There's still functions that are very much current for the MPs at that time.
And so what is the vision for how this would be recorded? Is it simply on the attendance form that we currently use, or is that a decision that has to be made? Right now I was traveling I was official business, illness, etc. Will there simply be another box there that will say pregnancy or parental leave? What's the mechanism for reporting?
Well, I think assuming that the House were to agree that to adopt this regulation, then the mechanism would be put in place, and it would be recorded to say this is the reason for the absence. And in addition to having illness and service in the armed force and public business, those absences would be justified, as it were.
Captured on that current reporting mechanism. Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Rodriguez?
Juste deux questions générales.
Two small questions in general. You've done some comparative analyses, of course, with other legislators or legislations. Who did we compare with? Well, we took a look at the provincial and territorial ones, Great Britain, Australia. Many of these assemblies make no deductions at all on their revenues. But there's an ethical point, of course. As MPs, we're responsible in the House, and if not, we have to justify why. So a lot of assemblies will, in fact, behave in this fashion. They'll do it with the authorization of the Speaker or on humanitarian or personal grounds that are valid, of course. Are there situations that you've encountered where one may be non-attendant for a fixed amount of time for maternity purposes? Yes. And what would they be? It varies. It depends on the situation. In some cases, it's a year. It can go up to a year or even more in some cases. But generally, the members will continue to be paid during the entire year. In certain cases, in some legislatures, they may deduct a portion, but it varies. It's a little bit different for parental leave per se, because while they may be away from their work, let's say in civilian life, they can be replaced, whereas in the House, you can't replace an MP who's been elected. So if there's an MP who becomes a mother or a father, let's say 1 month before the end of a mandate, and they have no intention of running again, well, the regulation would state that non-attendance in the House on these grounds will not be calculated for purposes of, no, let's say 4 months, okay? And the individual, male or female, becomes a mother or a father just before the close of a mandate or a session of Parliament. Well, look, once we drop the writ, we don't attend anymore, so that's it. It's a very hypothetical situation. Mr. Julian.
I wanted to underscore the work of Nicole Turmel, who's a former whip of the NDP, and Christine Moore, who's a member of Parliament for Abitibi-Témiscamingue, that have really been leaders, I think pioneers in pushing for an end to what is a pretty strange situation, that members of Parliament are penalized for caring for their children, and that is our current policy, and that's what I think we need to keep in perspective. We're currently penalizing parents for doing their work. It seems to me that this is a very reasonable approach, that to what it allows parents to do is to take the time with the children. But the reality is, as you've spelled out very well, Ms. Daigle and Mr. Dufresne, in any event, ultimately, voters are still going to require members of Parliament in their riding. And so what this does is ensure that there's not the financial penalty on top of that. There's still obligations that come. I have many friends in this Parliament that have gone through being new parents. They still have obligations. They still have to attend to things in the riding, there's no doubt. But what this does is end the penalty that members are currently subjected to when they do that. And I think for those reasons, this is a very responsible and appropriate approach.
Thank you. I'll go to Mr. Holland and then Mr. Strahl.
So I do think that the situation has been identified as somewhat unusual. It's very unusual in that the job continues, whether or not you're a parent. There's an expectation of continuing to represent the riding that you represent. So there's not really a lot of analogous situations where somebody has a child, is on maternity leave, but then is still expected to work. So there isn't an apples to apples type of comparison that can be made here. I think that in a generalized sense, that the comments that are being made that we shouldn't have anything that would be seen to be greater than what would be available to our constituents is one that I'm moved by. I don't know what exactly that number is. I'm open to proposals. I think Madam Chagger perhaps has an idea, and I think that we have to be we have to be careful as well about expectations. You can imagine in a minority government it might only sit 18 months, and if you say that somebody has 13 months in which they can be absent from the chamber, that could be quite challenging in terms of an establishment of an expectation as well. So the numbers as they are, I think, are a little too generous. I think we have to come with something perhaps a little different that's on the table.
Mr. Strahl.
Perhaps you can, I don't know if it's in the note here, if a new, say just for the 12-month portion, if a new parent decides to take the full 12 months, a member of Parliament, and simply fills out that doesn't tick any of the boxes and says, I wasn't there, I'm not pretending I was ill because I wasn't ill, I was just looking after my child. What is the financial penalty? It's $120 after a certain number of days away, but say they did not sit, or they did not come to Ottawa for that entire 12-month period, which of course we don't sit every week. What is the estimate in reduction in pay that they would incur as a result of doing that, of just doing it on their own and accurately reporting their attendance?
So if there were 1 year of unjustifiable absences in a given year, and there were had been 21 days in the previous year, the penalty would be of about 8% of the member's salary. So the member would still have the 92% in that scenario.
So that number is exactly what people who work for members of parliament receive in terms of their compensation. That's my understanding, is that if a staff member of a member of parliament goes on maternity leave, they're topped up above the EI to 92%. So even if a member currently who reports accurately receives the exact same benefit as the person who works for them, that's very interesting, I think, to me, because, you know, I understand what we're trying to do here, but I think we should have those numbers on the table, where we say even at that, that member is receiving a 38% better benefit than their constituents are, and exactly the same benefit as their employees are, or those people that work for the public service. So I throw that out there. That's very interesting statistic, and I think we need to bear in mind what we're proposing here. You know, we are already thought to be very well compensated, very generous benefits, and this is another step in that direction. We just have to be careful, I think, that we don't do anything that's unintentionally puts our members in a bad light. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Ms. Chagger.
Thank you.
Mr. Holland.
I thank you for the comments and the work that you've done in making a proposal. I do know that in Ontario, what would happen is the average person that is paying into EI that's working would be receiving their EI benefit at 60%, 55 or 60%, whatever it is. I know that we've now extended benefits so that the secondary parent, or however you want to refer to it, can also take up to 6 months. So I do believe that if we want the logic, which I think is well received, is that we don't want members of parliament to be better off than our constituents, perhaps offering a time that is proportionate to that benefit would be suitable. I know Minister Gould has written a letter with a recommendation of 4 months. So I'm wondering if, I'd even be comfortable with 5 months, 5.5 months, less than 6 months, just on the points that Mr. Holland has made as well. So I would like to throw some numbers out, because I think it would be important for us to offer a recommendation as a response to what PROC has asked, and I think that would actually allow us to take a step in the right direction. Currently, there are no benefits when it comes to paternity leave, and that is not okay if we're really trying to change the dynamics of the House of Commons and so forth. I really do like Mr. Straw's idea about having a box added regardless. So I think if it's additional time, there should be able to say paternity leave or whatever. If somebody's needing to take a day off because of a sick child or whatever, they should be able to say that, because you're not ill, taking care of your children is really important, and we do need to shed some positive light in that world. So I will throw out a number that's closer to Minister Gould's recommendation, and I would be more comfortable with a period of between, I'd say, 4, less than 6 months.
Thank you, Mr. Holland.
I completely concur with that timeline, and I just make the observation that because I also agree with Mr. Strahl that on the surface of it, you could leave the policy as it was, and it would seem as though the policy would be equal to what employees have today. In other words, the penalty is not all that large. 8% is not that significant. The real issue is what we're broadcasting as being acceptable. So when you're charged, it isn't necessarily about the fact that you are having a reduction. It's kind of a broadcasting you're doing something wrong, that you're not attending the House and therefore you're being penalized. And I think that if and conversely, we have to think about, if we say that you can have a year, then people are going to think that is, or excuse me, not even a year, we're talking about 13 months. People are going to come into the job, they become pregnant, and then say, okay, well, now I can disappear for 13 months. I think if we put the policy in, and I don't think that's appropriate, because given the nature of the work and the demands of the House, and particularly if there's a minority time frame, So I think having that period of 4 to 6 months, which is at what the which is recommended as a minimum by international labor standards, is appropriate. It broadcasts that we do want to encourage members to be able to have children, have families while they conduct this work. But it sort of gives some parameters around what those expectations are, so that if somebody makes the decision to take on this employment, then they can know what they're facing and what those expectations would be.
Thank you. I'd like to weigh into the discussion, and I may actually be on a completely different side than all of my colleagues on a few of the areas. I think it's important that we recognize that this is not at all like a maternity benefit, and we don't try to compare it to such. I think we could very well have female members of parliament who have a baby and literally a week later have events in their riding that they feel they must attend, or it could affect their chances of being reelected. They don't have the opportunity to take a year off and just enjoy their child with no pressure. They know they'll get their either 66 or, in the case of a federal employee, topped up amount. These members of parliament have to be working in their riding, and if they don't, they will be penalized and they will not be rehired for their jobs. So I personally don't think we should be trying to compare the two. Having said that, I don't think that members of parliament should then get less time where they are having that time with their child. So I like the 12-month approach, because I think that members of parliament should not be penalized because they're members of parliament, and they already will have to be working in their constituency. We're just talking about the work that they're doing away from their families and away from those newborns. I also would suggest that fathers play a vital role, and I think that male MPs whose wives are ready to have babies and they need that 4 weeks, maybe that those 4 weeks before that child is born, maybe they need to be home, maybe that baby's going to be early, they don't know when that baby's going to be born. I think we should give some consideration to that, to new dads who maybe need a bit of time before the child is born. Another issue, and I think actually maybe we should look at sending this to PROC, because there are a lot of questions that need to be discussed and have more fulsome conversation. Because Mr. Holland, you brought up a good topic about minority parliaments. And if we're in a minority parliament, here, let's say, we haven't even discussed this scenario, and maybe this is not part of the conversation, but I'm going to throw it out there. Imagine that we're in a minority parliament and one of the parties, either the opposition or the government, happens to have more females who happen to be getting ready to deliver babies during that particular time. And so, what if the scenario is that one of the parties now has 4 or 5 women who are on their maternity time and they're not able to be in the house? Like, they're actually, are we going to ask that there be a pairing? And is that something we just leave up to the whips and to the goodwill of each of the parties? But when we're at, in politics, we're actually talking about a government being defeated. I think there should be some discussion around that, because if we want to encourage not only females but young people who might be in that age period where they are having families. So I think that we're having a very good discussion. I like the idea of the box, because what we're actually doing is giving members of parliament, it's a legitimate reason to be at home. You don't have to just say, I'm just at home doing constituency work, or I'm not feeling good, when actuality you're not sick, you're looking after your newborn child. I really think it's important that we give the validity and the value and the credibility that it should have. But I think there's a lot of questions, so I'm suggesting we take it to PROC. But Mr. Holland, you have something more to add, and then Mr. Julian.
Yeah, I think you raise an excellent point with respect to the position that a party could be in not only in a minority situation. You could have a very thin majority situation where the numbers would be impacted by by members having a family, and therefore, as much as we have a policy in place, the policy effectively becomes irrelevant because the party is going to exert enormous pressure on those individuals to come back and be present for votes that might precipitate an election. And I don't know what, and maybe it's a question that I could place. That because I don't think we can force pairing. I mean, you could have a sort of a gentleman's agreement or an agreement, in principle, but there's no way to compel parties, I don't believe, to observe. If, for example, because I think that would be entirely appropriate to have mandatory pairing, but I don't think there's any way of enforcing that. Am I correct in that?
Currently, no. I want to point out in the United Kingdom, they did adopt a temporary standing order that allows for proxy voting for situations where members have parental obligations. So that allows them to identify a substitute for the vote. So it's a detailed standing order, and they've done that on a temporary basis.
So the point that I would make, so first of all, I do think that we need there's an expectation from PROC that we're going to give them some sort of direction. I think that's important. I'm very sensitive, Ms. Bergen, to the points you're raising, and I think that issue of pairing, of being able to assure that that you're not creating a precarious situation in the chamber as a result of these policies, it has to be considered, because in the absence of it, frankly, it renders this policy irrelevant, because it doesn't matter whether or not we're saying that somebody can be on a maternity leave if there's a circumstance where their vote is demanded, or there's going to be an election. We know what's going to happen. So I don't think that any policy we recommend, there has to be something, and if there is an opportunity to make it in a way that can be assured to be enforced, I think we should look at it.
All right, I have Mr. Julian and then Ms. Chagger.
Well, I think you pointed out, Madam Chair, that what we're actually talking about is two workplaces. There is two workplaces that every member of Parliament has. One is here, and currently, if you come here to Ottawa, or if you miss that session, you're penalized by not being present in the House of Commons. But in no way does this have an impact on the constituency work that members of Parliament continue to do. And there's no mythical MP that doesn't do work in the constituency, because somebody who doesn't do work in their constituency doesn't get reelected. So members of Parliament are still working during this period. These parental obligations have to be balanced with that constituency work. All that's being suggested by this policy is that we stop the penalizing from that second workplace. The first workplace continues. And so with those considerations, I find that this is a very reasonable policy, and if we provided PROC with direction, then we could seek to get things implemented. If we continue to talk about what this should actually mean, and we compare it to other workplaces, I certainly believe very strongly that we need to be raising up parental leave provisions, and I'm certainly sympathetic to raising the parental leave provisions in this country. But in the two workplaces right now, the first workplace continues, the second workplace, hopefully we would end the penalties. I think that's a very reasonable proposal, and all the members of Parliament from all parties that I have seen working, going through the birth of a new child, they're all still working. Some of them hope not to have to come to Ottawa for a certain period of time, but currently they're being penalized if they do that. And I think it's reasonable for us to adopt this policy and provide that direction of PROC so we can move on.
Thank you. Madam Chagger?
Just to confirm, Mr. Julian is stating that you're comfortable with this recommendation?
Yes.
In its entirety. I think that's great as well then. I just want to say, I do think this work has been done. PROC has studied this matter. They've asked this board for a recommendation. I think a unanimous recommendation should be offered to members of PROC, and then they would be able to table their report, and it could be concurred in with all party support, and we'd have movement. I think what we're recognizing is that this is definitely a conversation that has many different layers, and those conversations have to start somewhere. This is a step that I think needs to be taken. I think it speaks volumes, and that those other conversations can definitely take place. So I would totally support Mr. Julian's comments in saying that this should be the recommendation that we offer to PROC.
Mr. Strahl?
Could you enlighten us on, is there a limit for illness, for instance? Could someone, we had members in the last parliament who were essentially elected who found out they had a very serious disease, and unfortunately in those cases they've since passed away, but sometimes a battle with cancer or something like that could go on for years, right? And we've had those tragic cases here. Is there such a limit? I think what Ms. Bergen has reminded us of is that this is simply a way to justify your absence. It's not leave. Like I don't think anyone, leave for someone in the private sector is just that. You see all the time maternity leave placements and things like that. They go away, they pack up their desk, they're gone for 12 months if they choose to do so. This is different, and obviously our constituents will obviously be the judges, as they always are, of whether or not we have been away too much from this place. That's a reality. They don't care what box we tick. They might say, well, you missed too many important discussions, you missed too many, and that we all make those choices when we travel each week, quite frankly. So to let you answer my question could you be on any of those three things? I always forget the middle one: the public or official business, the illness, and
Armed forces.
Armed forces. So could you essentially be deployed for 4 years? Could you be ill for 4 years, or could you be on official business for 4 years and not have a single dollar deducted from your paycheck?
Well, and I think the short answer is yes. There's no time limit, and we are talking about valid justifications for absences from the chamber, which is why we're not, in presenting this, we didn't talk about, it's not leave so much as a justification for an absence, and there's no time limits provided for the categories of illness, public business, and service in the armed forces.
So I suggest that's already more generous than any private sector arrangement.
Well, again, it's difficult to compare because it's
It
different.
It is. So perhaps that's not perhaps I started a bad trend there, but I'm comfortable with this. But I do think in terms of what we need, I'm more comfortable having PROC, even though we have given kind of our stamp of approval on it. I think that PROC should be the body that sets regulation and deals with, standing orders, regulation, legislation regarding the Parliament of Canada. So I would be happy to concur with Ms. Jaggers and Mr. Julian's comments.
Mr. Holland, you had something else you wanted to add?
Yeah, I concur with that. I'm comfortable moving forward on that basis. The only thing that I would add, and I don't want to slow this up because I understand the recommendation with PROC. PROC can make a decision quickly, and we have a limited amount of time in our calendar. But perhaps for a future at a future time to be able to address the issue of pairing and about assuring that there's actually a means to protect that leave. And that also is in a situation of serious illness, right? If somebody is seriously ill, and we've seen this before, and somebody is being brought back when they're in a very poor condition into the chamber to vote because it's going to precipitate an election, that seems to me to be an unfair circumstance. And it's certainly unfair that somebody be pulled. It makes sense they're going to be doing work in the riding, and they're continuing to be in the riding, but to be pulled in that period back, I think is problematic. So I think if we could have that looked at and have something perhaps come back, and then we can make a recommendation to PROC.
No, we should make a recommendation now.
Okay, well, if I just don't know, I don't know what that mechanism is my problem. And so I need assistance in understanding what tools would be at our disposal. And I don't necessarily want to slow this process down, but I would be interested in understanding what tools would be at our disposal to be able to affect that so that people who are on a leave, like a serious medical leave, are not in a situation where they're being dragged out of a hospital bed into the chamber. If we could have something that assured that pairing was present, And I think it's a good time to have that conversation, frankly, because we're not in a heightened situation in the immediate moment of a minority government where there could be a vote that's very tight.
Mr. Strahl?
Yeah, I would think that would be more appropriate for PROC in a more comprehensive review of the standing orders. I know that there have been members of our caucus that have had have the belief that the whip should not have a role to play in pairing, for instance. That matter has been brought forward, that should be 2 members should be able to make that arrangement. I think we could, in the fullness of looking at exactly what that meant, I'm uncomfortable with any suggestion that we would start to erode the value or the importance of a member being present to vote in the House. I think you could you'd open Pandora's box there about, well, if it's okay because I'm on maternity leave, then it's okay because I'm ill, then it's okay because I need to be at home because I have a family emergency. Like, you would open it up to interpretation, and why is your emergency or why is your situation more valid than mine for having an automatic paired vote or an automatic proxy vote. I think this needs to be treated, if we're going to entertain it at all, that's a very, very serious discussion that needs a lot more time than the 17 sitting days that we have left in this Parliament.
All right. I would add, I do agree with Mr. Strahl. I know I'm the one who brought the issue forward, but I think we should keep it separate from this particular issue. So at this point, I do think, though, PROC should be looking at this. I still would like them to look at the issue I brought forward around male MPs who are fathers being able to possibly access that 4 weeks before the due date. But I think there is consensus then that we would refer this to PROC and let them look at this in greater detail. All right?
Just to clarify, Madam Chair, so we are supportive of the policy as written and referring it back to PROC. Yes. Yeah.
We're supportive of the report and the proposal, and we'd like to send it to PROC. Correct? All right, good. Thank you. And I think
We can suspend.
we'll suspend now. Are we going to?
We're gonna go
All right,
to
we're
camera.
going to suspend. We'll be going into camera.
Aye.